Well, as a child, I stopped questioning authority, which was a nightmare after I graduated high school and had to go live on my own in college because I didn't have critical thinking skills. So, how did I compensate for that?
Yeah.
I became a control freak. So, an addiction. I was addicted to controlling absolutely everything I thought I could because I felt like there were so many things outside of my control.
Awekenge, this is Mental Mythos, hosted by textWhat.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Mental Mythos. I'm your host, textWhat. And before we dive into today's incredible conversation, I have a small favor to ask. If you enjoy what you hear today, please take a moment to rate and review our podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen. Your feedback not only helps us improve, but also helps others discover the valuable insights we share every week. And if you find today's episode particularly inspiring or insightful, don't forget to share it with your friends, family, or anyone you think could benefit from it. Thank you for your support. It truly means the world to us. Now, let's get back into our conversation.
It really, your story is filled with resilience and self discovery and empowerment, and it's something that being able to, I would say, a survivor of stage 4 cancer. I am quite sure that the process was quite hard, and definitely, as I've said, it was not easy. Hopefully, through this conversation, we'll be able to dive deeply on that. So, on my first question towards you is, can you take us back to the moment you were diagnosed with stage 4 cancer? What was your initial reaction and how did you impact your life?
Well, it's a really interesting question because the first time I was diagnosed with cancer, I was actually 21 years old. And so to say that first time with a stage 4 diagnosis was not the first time that I received a cancer diagnosis. And so when you talk about this idea of being resilient isn't about overcoming so you never have to overcome again. Being resilient is doing the work in the moment so that no matter what shows up, you're able to show up for it. And so when I think about going back to that first diagnosis, I was 21 years old, almost 22. I was actually getting ready to run the Leukemia Foundation Marathon in Maui and had gone in for a physical. And my doctor, it was a team. I was very actively involved in my own healthcare, wellness care, and she found a lump. And so we set about doing the right things. Went and had a lump, went and had a biopsy. But I said to her, don't call me with results. Don't email them. Don't send them via homing pigeon or smoke signal. I'll call you when I get home from Maui because I'm running this marathon. And then when I got home, of course, the prognosis was such that I had a lumpectomy and started chemo right away. And then within 6 weeks, they found another lump. And so at that point, I had a radical mastectomy and reconstructive surgery and really began to look at my life quite differently, as one might imagine. It's not so much about the body, but we have to take care of the body because that's what carries us through this experience.
Yes, definitely. In terms of how taking care of your body, it means that you taking care of also your mental well-being. If you don't take care of one, the one will suffer. That's what I have recognized with my journey in terms of these things. And also, the first time that you were diagnosed, definitely you had anxiety. You didn't. I would say you didn't expect it. So usually when we come across such news as individuals, we have these internal dialogues of saying that I would say talking negative towards us. For example, let's say I'm diagnosed with depression, and there's the stigma around depression, whereas that I am crazy in terms of that. Where those internal dialogues to upon you, were they really that much in terms of negative, or you 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 took a positive stand?
It's a really great question, especially for the first time around, because the first time around, I was just gobsmacked. Like, I was a rule follower. I ate healthy. I was running marathons for the love of all things good. I was very active. I ate well. I took care of myself. And so for me, the big question and the stigma is I just didn't understand. It's like I'm doing everything I'm supposed to. And so the myth that I got to break through, like so many others get to the opportunity to do, no matter what their diagnosis is, I get to break through the stigma of what society says went wrong or what society would presume is wrong with me, and to just really learn to set opinions of everyone around me aside. And it's not that you cancel them. You know, in 2024, we all know what that means, cancel culture. It's not that we're canceling someone.
Yeah.
But what we're doing is we're taking a step back so that we can get really clear on what's going on in our body, in our mind, in our heart, so that when someone comes up with a question or a suggestion or an idea, like everybody wants to help. But if you've never been there before, and guess what? No one's ever been exactly where you are because they're not you. So the best they can do is come with an open heart, wanting to help. But as we all know, whether it's mental, physical, spiritual, or emotional, just because someone shows up to help doesn't mean they're there to do it in the right way that we can receive or that is helpful to us. And oftentimes the reason it's not helpful to us or we can't receive it is because we're not clear on what's going on with us. And we're so wrapped up in the opinions of those around us that what they say takes precedence over what I feel.
And
And I don't think that's how it's intended to be.
definitely, because there's this thing, and more especially when it comes to where have you experienced a very traumatic event where people say they consoled you in terms of, no, it's going to be all right, just think positively. They don't actually understand, comprehend the trauma that you have dealt with in terms of how it shook you in a way that you didn't realize that it would. And also, people have this thing of wanting to give you advices. And something that I love about psychoanalysis is the fact that one of things that psychotherapists is needs to do is the fact that not to give advice but to listen. Sometimes, as much as we appreciate the advice, but we don't need it. We need you to listen in terms of us finding that thing of realizing that there's someone that cares about me. For someone, for my perspective in terms of, I also went through a traumatic event, and one thing that I didn't have is for someone to listen to me, and it was very, very hard to move on. And one thing that I've realized through having this podcast, it really pushed me in a way, because I was able to talk about my pain, and someone and the audience on the other side were listening to, were not judging me, and they were not giving me advice. That at least at the end of the day, I realized that someone out there is listening to me. Someone out there is not judging me. Someone out there knows my story without judgment. That's the thing that nowadays I'm seeing, is the fact that when, as mentioned earlier, when you say you have depression, you are crazy. When you have a bipolar, you are crazy. So there's these misconceptions about mental health in general. So one thing that I realized when I was reading your bio, it mentioned religious trauma. Can you explain to us what is that?
Well, I think the easiest way to explain it to you is to give you an example. So I grew up in a household where it was very patriarchally driven. The father was the head of the household. I don't have any problem with that. The trauma comes in because I grew up in an environment where you do what you are told to do, not because you understand the why or the critical thinking skills behind what you're being asked to do, but because not the consequences of not doing it were dire. The punishment, the discipline that would come from even questioning. Forget asking questions about what you're doing, but never ask the question why, because that why question was received as questioning my father.
Questioning the authority.
Questioning authority. Thank you. Yes. And it wasn't for me. Look, I wasn't a rebellious kid, but I was a curious child. And I wanted to know and I wanted to understand. And so, for example, in the first grade, so Sunday school, Sunday morning, right? We're talking about, Mrs. Johnson is my Sunday school teacher, and I'm in there, I'm 7, 8 years old. And we're talking about from a religious perspective, we're talking about the concept that Jesus died for our sins, past, present, and future. So that curious little 7 or 8-year-old in me raised her hand and said, well, Mrs. Johnson, if Jesus died for our sins, past, present, and future, then why are we all stressed out?
Yeah.
Seems like a reasonable question, right?
Yeah.
Well, what happened after I asked that question was Mrs. Johnson came and she took me by the hand and she led me to the pastor's office. She went and got my parents, and then Pastor Wooden came in. Mrs. Johnson explained what had transpired, that I had asked this question. My father looked at Pastor Wooden, tapped me on the shoulder, stood up, apologized, and said, you have my word, she will never question again. So at 7 or 8 years old, I learned not to question, because the consequences when I got home for questioning someone in a position of authority, my Sunday school teacher, the consequences are not something I wanted to revisit again, ever. And so I learned not to ask the important questions. And so from a mental health perspective, you constantly feel put upon. You constantly feel there's a fear that you're going to do it wrong because you're not allowed to ask qualifying questions or curious questions or critical thinking skills questions. And of course, I didn't know what all of those were when I was 7 or 8 years old. But as I grew up, still not being able to question quote unquote authority, but to do as I was told because I was told this, it morphed into a place where I never trusted myself. And I think so many of us that deal, whether it's religious trauma or whether we deal with a mental illness or a physical illness, is that we don't trust ourselves. So we farm it out to all of these people around us that are supposed to know, but why would they know? They're not me, especially from a mental health perspective. Yes, whether it's a talk therapist or a psychologist or just a friend, as you said a few moments ago, we shouldn't be looking to them to fix us, but that person can be the person that shifts things so foundationally for us, simply because they allow us the space to feel heard, to feel seen, and to be seen and heard without judgment, without the need to fix me. Yes, I know that there's things that I want to change, and whether it's mental, physical, spiritual, emotional, we all have things we want to work on and change. But to be constantly put upon that there's something wrong with us that we need to be fixed is a narrative I will no longer accept. Because I'm not broken. You're not broken.
Definitely. one thing that I have realized, the fact that people that have experienced childhood trauma as you, the people have experienced depression, anxiety, bipolar any type of disorder, there's this thing of that meaning of brokenness, and people that think that they are more qualified of doing the job, not mentioning the mental health professional, but just individual people that have seen other people going through the same thing, thinking that you are also going through the same thing, but whereas as individuals we don't feel the same thing. And one thing that I have I think 3 or 4 hours ago I had a guest, whereas we spoke about trauma, and I love the fact that she said that we don't respond different. Respond differently to trauma as individuals, because clearly we respond differently. The reason why I put an emphasis on that is the fact that, for example, our coping mechanisms are very different. It's funny how I had 3 interviews. This is the third interview today, and I love the fact that all these interviews were talking about trauma and the coping mechanism that were there, because the other guy, it was he in terms of trauma, his coping mechanism was drinking and eating food, and that caused another mental health in terms of issues. And one thing that I've realized is the fact that we all, when we experience trauma, I think there's a strong link between childhood trauma and addiction. And in terms of your own perspective, as someone who has experienced trauma, how did you find coping mechanism at we accept the fact that you stop listening, you stop questioning authority?
Well, as a child, I stopped questioning authority, which was a nightmare after I graduated high school and had to go live on my own in college because I didn't have critical thinking skills. So, how did I compensate for that?
Yeah.
I became a control freak. So, an addiction. I was addicted to controlling absolutely everything I thought I could because I felt like there were so many things outside of my control. So what I could control, I laugh now that I'm a recovering triple A personality, not just a recovering type A personality. I'm all 3 A's, man. I was I was such a control freak, to the detriment not only of my relationships, work, personal, otherwise, but also to myself, because I was seen as something by those around me that I wasn't. So for me, my addiction in that space became control, and not always in a graceful way. Matter of fact, most times not in a graceful way. Because control, if we think we can control something, it puts us back as the navigator in our own experience. It's just like if we are, whether it's depression or bipolar, or maybe it's, for me, quadriplegia. To be a doer and wake up from a stroke now as a quadriplegic. I mean, you want to talk about needing to set aside the idea of control. I literally have to rely on someone around me for 95 to 98% of my movement, my activity. I can't control when they do it, necessarily how they do it, how expeditiously they do it, how gently they do it. I get to learn to accept people where they're at. But in order to do that, and here's the kicker, in order to accept other people where they're at, we have to learn to accept ourselves and to honor and cherish ourselves exactly where we are at. Because if we can't do it, how can we expect someone else to?
Definitely. It goes back to that thing of, if I don't love myself, how can I love someone else? I think it goes back to that. And going back to, as you said, that you were a very controlling person, and
Oh, very.
you are recovering from that. And just to go back to Jordan Peterson's teachings, in terms of, I feel like he's one of the best psychologists or influential people that are out there, where he said, you at first you are a fool when you start something new. And going back in terms of recovery, how did you feel in terms of the discomfort of trying to get into recovery, of just throwing away your old habits and trying some new ones? Because it's something that I just love to use this word. How did you adapt to unfamiliar pain?
It's a really great question. I'm going to fast forward in my story to 2007, because in 2007, I had a cancer diagnosis and I got my very first expiration date. Doctor calls me into his office. Really sorry, Amilynne, amongst other things. And of course, I'm paraphrasing here.
Yeah.
You need to go home and make sure you've got your business in order. I don't think you'll make it 6 weeks. So I did what most human beings would do. I went home and I bawled like a baby for 3 days. Like, again, I'm a rule follower. I do what I'm supposed to. I'm always, overachiever was an understatement for me. And if I wasn't overachieving, then I was, for me, if it wasn't an A, it was an F. And so this idea that I had been such a rule follower and I had taken such good care of myself, to now be told I have 6 weeks. So that third day I woke up and I realized that what he had shared with me was his best opinion about what was going on in my life. And so I began to question absolutely everything I believe. And I began to realize that so many of my belief patterns were based on people around me, my parents, my teachers, my professors, my coworkers, my boss, my spouses, my siblings, the stranger on the subway. Like, everybody else's opinion and belief took precedence over my own. And so when I then began to ask the question, well, what do I believe? I had no blooming idea. I could tell you what everybody around me professed to believe, but I had no idea what I believed. And if I didn't know what I believed, how could I understand who I am? And how can I honor and cherish who I am if I have no blooming idea who I am or what I am? And so this questioning became instrumental in plot shift, in that plot twist, in shifting that mindset from being a victim of cancer to being a victim of cancer and being, are you ready for this? The victim of someone else's opinion of what was going on in my life. I began to understand what I am. Notice I didn't say who, but what. And I really had to spend a lot of time and ask a lot of questions. But at the end of that, for me, the answer of why I could never figure out who I am is because I was asking the wrong question. So when I started asking what I am, well, I'm an expression of the universe. Wait a second. I don't care what spiritual texts you read, every one of them starts with a perfect, whole, and complete creation. And that includes humans. That includes our very essence. So if I started out as a perfect, whole, and complete human being, well, how about, again, that was his best understanding of what was going on in my life. So I went cold turkey off meds. And what I'm about to say, I do not recommend for anyone else. What is right for you. And for me, I needed clarity. So I went off all of my meds. I needed to feel again. I needed to think with clarity again. And so often the chemicals within a prescription or drugs that are meant to help us, they cloud other aspects of our life. So I'm not a proponent of just going cold turkey off meds without support. I had a registered nurse who came and stayed with me for 2 weeks. You have to take care of yourself while you're preparing yourself to be cared for. So I went cold turkey off all the meds. I went to whole food eating. I did a complete cleanse of my life, including those beliefs. I started questioning everything. And in that space, I began to find me so that I could understand the childhood traumas and I could hold that little girl and apologize and tell her that it really is going to be okay. I have no idea what it's going to look like, but look, I'm here now. I've kind of been mailing it in for 30 plus years at that point in my life because I was doing what I thought everybody else wanted me to do or needed me to do to be happy. So now I'm beginning to figure out what I am. And look, if my very essence goes back to the originality of perfect, whole, and complete, well, how do I get back to that, right? Especially if you're talking for physical illness is one thing. Mental well-being is an entirely different thing because it's hidden. People can't see that. So like, I'm a quadriplegic. People know there's something physically different about me.
Definitely.
But if you live with depression or bipolar or schizophrenia or ADHD or like pick an ailment, if you live with a mental wellness challenge, it's invisible. And so guess what happens? We begin to feel invisible because we don't know how to talk about it. We don't know how to ask questions to get the support we need. And people around us don't know how to ask questions of us. So in figuring out what my belief patterns were, in figuring out what I am, another idea that came into this is, are you familiar with the Japanese artwork called kintsugi?
Unfortunately, no.
Okay, so I'll spell it for you just so you and your listeners. It's KINTSUGI. And it's a Japanese art form. And essentially what the overall story is, a very delicate piece of china was broken. That porcelain was broken. And instead of sweeping it up and tossing it out.
I think I'm familiar with it. Now I
With the
think
concept,
about it.
yeah. Gold, silver, bronze. They used these precious metals to put that piece of porcelain back together. And now that piece of china is considered so much more valuable because the time, the energy, the effort to pull it back together, to bind its wounds with precious metals, that teacup, that plate, that vase is now so much more precious and valuable because instead of discarding when it was quote unquote broken, it was reimagined in something far greater than it was before. So much so that they were using precious metals that weren't easy to find to do the work of putting it back together. They could have very easily just used what you and I would think of as Elmer's glue.
Definitely.
I mean, Elmer's glue didn't exist when kintsugi first came into being, but I mean, I'm sure they had a comparable, component they could have used to our Elmer's glue or super glue. But no, they took the time. They took the time to weave that precious metal, that gold, through that piece of porcelain that had been broken. So when we are feeling less than, it's about asking the questions. I can't tell you how often I will say, like, especially if I'm not, like, I'm just struggling on any given day, I'll be like, okay, Amilynne, what do you need? And sometimes I'll get out a piece of paper and I'll just brain dump. This is what I need. But Then what I've done, okay, I've done the brain dump. Now what do I do with this, right? Because now what I've got is I've got a full page full of needs. Another approach that I've used in the past, actually not in the past, use it quite frequently, is you or your readers may be, or your listeners, sorry, may be familiar with a woman by the name of Byron Katie. And she has a process called the work. And there's 4 questions. I won't go into all the details, but one of the most important questions is that true? So when I'm looking at this full page dump of needs, then I ask the question, is it true? Do I need this? Do I need this? Do I need this? And I just start going down the page. Do I really need this? Or is all of this just a distraction to the work I know I need to be doing right now? We get to feel seen. We get to be heard. But in order to be seen for who we are, to be heard for who we are, we have to have a general idea of who and what we are. Otherwise, we could be being seen and not know it. We could be being heard and not know it because we're still so outwardly focused on what the needs are around us that it doesn't compute that we are actually being seen and heard. And when we don't know who we are or what we are, well, it makes it really hard to ask for what we need.
Definitely, and you really touched on so many things that are very crucial to today's conversation. For example, in terms of perspective, and I always felt that perspective is very important because what you hear from people and you end up believing it is you in your mind. In a way, it makes it through. For example, you think that you will die within 6 weeks, but at the end of the day, you're still here. So I feel all these things about perspective, and I love the fact that you said that you write things down and ask yourself that, is this true? That's an amazing question, because one thing that I've realized is the fact that we have redefined what we need, what is a need, and we actually, in a way, we have shifted. We have made wants into needs, needs into wants, whereas we are lost within ourselves. I just, in terms of another thing that I really, in terms of really that I keep on pushing is us accepting ourselves. In terms of that thing goes with self-discovery, self-love, self-care, being able to say to talk with yourself in affirmations, not negative affirmation, positive affirmations, because at the end of the day, if you don't say those affirmation within yourself, if you don't compliment yourself within yourself to have, as I mentioned earlier about the internal dialogue, if you don't do those things, have that genuine conversation with yourself and saying that I'm worth it and I'll go past this and I won't believe what people say about me, that's where you realize that you have reached the pinnacle of self-love. I really, in terms of this conversation, has, in a way, it's something that is very empowering as one of your work that you really you're pushing in terms of self-empowerment. Self-empowerment is very important because at some point in our lives, we expect things from people at some point that sometimes we don't even get those things. For example, empowerment. For example, people expect that people, like, not to throw shots and stuff to people, but in a way are expecting to people that are advocate for mental health to say, no, go out there, you can do it in terms of those things. What if you can't do that yourself? If you wait for people to do that for yourself, you will never move. That's what I believe in, that you will never.
They can't do it for us. They can't. Much as so many people who genuinely care about us and love us, they would love to take that burden off our shoulders, whether it's mental, physical, spiritual, emotional. I have people I would love to take that off of their shoulders for them, but we can't. We simply can't. And so when we are able to get really honest about who and what we are, and remember, this idea of self-care, I want to encourage you to take it one step further. And so for me, in my background, one of the things from a metaphysical perspective that is really helpful is for me to recognize the difference between the metaphysical and the physical. And the metaphysical is the spiritual. And the metaphysical is not religion, but it's spirituality. And spirituality is our connectedness with source. And I don't care what you call source. Source can be God, it can be Allah, it can be the dandelion growing out front. But source is what we come from. And if we can remember that we were created perfect, whole, and complete by source, universe, creator, God, then what that allows us to do is to recognize that we might not be our best self today, but I still have the opportunity to return to that space of perfect, whole, and complete, because the only place that I have left the space of perfect, whole, and complete is in my thought. And my thought doesn't change reality. It changes the perception of reality. When we go back and we talk about this thing like self-care, so many people are like, oh my gosh, left wing, woke. Like, no. Self-care is twofold. From a metaphysical perspective, that self has a capital S. Self-care means, am I in alignment with my true essence, my absolute best understanding belief of who and what I am? So for me, am I seeing myself the way God sees me? Do I see myself the way the universe that created me perfect, whole, and complete sees me? Or am I seeing through Amilynne's eyes, the physical eyes that see that, well, my legs don't work, my arms don't work, I've got a pimple on my cheek, or, I've got a streak of gray hair. Like, all of the physical descriptors are changeable. But what is never changeable about us is the true essence of who and what we are. And again, I say this, we were created, and this is universal across so many spiritual teachings. As human beings, we were created perfect, whole, and complete. And we make mistakes.
Definitely.
And we make choices that we wish we had made differently. And that doesn't make something wrong with us. It makes us human.
Definitely, in terms of, as much as you make mistakes, but the goal is not to make the same mistake twice, because you need to learn about that mistake. And also something very crucial that you mentioned is the metaphysical and physical. And it's something that as individuals don't look upon. It's something that we think that, as you said, that the left wing, you think you are woke. But you are with yourself, you realize that. And also the thing of identity is very important, and knowing as you mentioned, that you don't ask who you are, but you ask what you are. It is the same thing. It's a pity that I just wanna continue this conversation. Unfortunately, I'm seeing that we are running out of time. I would like to say thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much for the knowledge and being able to have this genuine conversation. Because, in all honesty, I had 2-page questions about this in this episode, but what I did, I just wanted this to be genuine, to be able to share our own perspective in terms of in the field of mental health, as someone that has suffered a lot as someone that has experienced, as someone that has a lot of wisdom, because I believe that wisdom doesn't come from old age, but it comes from experience.
Experience. Yes.
Experience. So I just want to say thank you so much. And
Oh, you're welcome. You're so welcome. Thank you for having me in this space. And hey,